Have you ever loved someone who kept walking away, only to come back when it was convenient? Someone who made you feel special one day and invisible the next. Here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Not every return is a second chance. Some returns are just repeated patterns in disguise. Avoidants don't always come back because they've changed. Sometimes they come back because they miss the comfort, not the commitment. And if you don't recognize the signs, you won't just reopen the door, you'll reopen the same wound. So before you take an avoidant back, make sure they're not bringing the same behavior that broke you in the first place. Because love shouldn't feel like emotional whiplash, and your peace is too valuable to gamble twice. They don't always come back because they suddenly realize your value. Sometimes they come back because they felt your absence. And there is a difference, a powerful difference, between someone missing you and someone choosing you. When an avoidant returns only after you begin to move on, it reveals something deeper than love. It reveals discomfort with distance, not commitment to connection. You see, when you start healing, something changes in your energy. You stop waiting for their messages. You stop checking your phone every few minutes. You begin to rebuild your life piece by piece without them. And that's when they feel it. Not because you told them, not because you reached out, but because you reached out chasing. And for someone who is used to controlling the distance, this shift can feel unsettling. So they come back. They come back with warmth, with attention, with the version of themselves you were always hoping to see. Suddenly, they are texting more. Suddenly, they're showing interest again. Suddenly, they're saying things that sound like growth. And in that moment, it feels like everything you wanted is finally happening. It feels like maybe this time will be different. But here's the truth. Timing alone is not growth. Returning alone is not change. Because if someone only chooses you when you're leaving, they're not choosing you. They're choosing the comfort of not losing you. And those are two very different motivations. One is built on love. The other is built on fear. Avoidants often struggle with closeness, but they also struggle with loss. They want space, but they don't want you to disappear. They want independence, but they don't want to feel abandoned. So when you begin to move forward, they experience something they didn't expect. They realize you're not waiting anymore, and that's when they step back in. Not always because they're ready to stay, but because they're not ready to let go. And this creates a cycle. They pull away when things get close. They return when you move on. You feel hopeful again. Then slowly, the distance begins to grow. The communication fades. The effort decreases. And before you realize it, you're back in the same emotional place where you started, confused, anxious, and wondering what changed. But nothing changed. Only the timing did. Real growth doesn't depend on your distance. Real change happens regardless of whether you're leaving or staying. When someone has truly evolved, they don't wait until they're losing you to show up differently. They show up consistently. They show up intentionally. They show up with clarity. Because when someone truly values you, they don't wait for your absence to recognize your presence. And this is where you have to be honest with yourself. Ask yourself, did they come back with clarity? Or did they come back with uncertainty? Did they return with consistency or just intensity? Did they show long-term change or just temporary effort? Because intensity can feel like love, but consistency is what proves it. You deserve someone who chooses you when things are calm, not just when things are ending. You deserve someone who doesn't need to lose you to realize your worth. And most importantly, you deserve a love that doesn't disappear every time it gets real. Because when someone only returns when you move on, they're not showing you that they've changed. They're showing you that they're afraid of losing access, not ready to build commitment. And love built on fear will always feel unstable. But love built on growth, that's the kind that stays. One of the clearest signs that nothing has truly changed is when they still avoid emotional conversations. Because growth doesn't just show up in grand gestures or warm messages. It shows up in the moments that feel uncomfortable. It shows up when conversations become deeper, when feelings become vulnerable, and when honesty becomes necessary. And if they still pull away in those moments, then what you're seeing isn't transformation. It's the same pattern wearing a different face. At first, everything might seem different. They return with more attention, more kindness, more presence. It feels like they're trying. And for a while, they might even maintain that effort. But eventually, every relationship reaches a point where emotions must be discussed, where questions about the future arise, where past hurts need to be addressed. And that's when you begin to notice the shift. You try to talk about how things felt before. They change the subject. You ask where the relationship is going. They become distant. You express your feelings. They suddenly need space. And slowly, you realize you're walking on the same emotional ground again. Avoidants don't just struggle with closeness, they struggle with emotional exposure. Deep conversations require openness, and openness requires vulnerability. And vulnerability for someone with avoidant tendencies can feel overwhelming. It can feel like losing control. So instead of leaning in, they lean out. Instead of talking through things, they shut down. Instead of addressing the issue, they withdraw. But here's the truth. Love cannot grow where communication is avoided. You can have chemistry. You can have attraction. You can even have history. But without emotional conversations, you don't have real connection. Because connection is built through understanding. It's built through listening. It's built through the willingness to sit in discomfort and still choose each other. When someone has truly changed, they don't run from these moments anymore. They might still feel uncomfortable, but they stay. They listen. They try. Growth doesn't mean they become perfect communicators overnight, but it does mean they stop avoiding the very conversations that define the relationship. And this is where many people get confused. They mistake silence for peace. They think, at least we're not arguing. But silence isn't always peace. Sometimes, silence is just avoidance. Sometimes, it's unresolved emotions waiting quietly beneath the surface. And over time, that silence creates distance. You start holding back your feelings because you don't want them to pull away again. You stop asking questions because you're afraid of losing them. You begin shrinking your emotions just to keep the connection alive. But love should never require you to shrink. If someone truly wants to build something lasting, they don't avoid the conversations that matter. Wow, they lean into them. They show curiosity. Instead of defensiveness, they offer reassurance instead of distance. They make you feel heard instead of dismissed, because when someone is ready for love, they don't just show up when things are easy. They show up when things are emotionally challenging too. So pay attention, not just to how they act when everything feels good, but how they respond when things become real. Do they open up or do they retreat? Do they stay present or do they disappear? Do they listen or do they shut down? Because the way someone handles emotional conversations tells you everything about their readiness for a relationship. And if they still avoid those moments, if they still pull away when feelings are involved, then the return wasn't growth. It was familiarity. It was comfort. It was the same story, trying to start over again. You deserve someone who doesn't fear your emotions, someone who doesn't disappear when you open your heart, someone who understands that love isn't just about being present in the good moments, but also about staying connected in the uncomfortable ones. Because when someone is truly ready, they don't avoid emotional conversations. They embrace them, knowing that real love is built in those very moments. Apologies can be powerful. They can soften the heart, reopen doors, and make you believe that things are finally changing. When someone looks at you and says they're sorry, when they acknowledge the pain they caused, it's natural to want to believe them, because part of you has always hoped they would understand. Part of you has always waited for that moment of realization. And when it finally comes, it feels like progress. But an apology without changed behavior is not growth. It's reassurance without responsibility. It's words that sound comforting in the moment, but fade when real effort is required. Avoidants often return with sincere-sounding apologies. They might tell you they didn't realize how much they hurt you. They might admit they were overwhelmed or confused. They might promise they'll do better this time. And for a while, it feels genuine. It feels like they finally see things clearly. You want to believe that the pain you went through led to understanding. You want to believe that this time, things will be different. But then, slowly, the same patterns begin to appear again. They start pulling away when things get deeper. They become inconsistent with communication. They withdraw when conflict arises. They create distance when closeness begins to grow. And suddenly, you find yourself back in the same emotional cycle, except now it hurts more. Because this time, they knew. This time, they apologized. This time, they promised. That's the difference between someone who is sorry and someone who is sorry expresses regret. Someone who has changed expresses growth through action. And action is what rebuilds trust. Trust is fragile, especially after distance and confusion. It doesn't return because of a single conversation. It doesn't return because of a single conversation. It doesn't rebuild overnight. It requires consistency. It requires patience. It requires someone showing you, again and again, that they are no longer the person who hurt you before. And this is where you have to pay attention, not to what they say, but to what they repeat. Because patterns don't lie. Words can sound convincing, but behavior always reveals the truth. You might hear them say, they won't disappear again, but do they remain present when things get uncomfortable? You might hear them promise better communication, but do they actually open up when it matters? You might hear them say they've changed, but do their actions reflect stability, or do they still create uncertainty? Because real change is not loud. It doesn't come in dramatic promises. It comes in quiet consistency. It comes in someone showing up when they used to pull away. It comes in someone staying when they used to leave. It comes in someone listening when they used to shut down. And when those actions are missing, the apology becomes temporary comfort. It becomes something that makes you feel hopeful in the beginning, only to leave you disappointed in the end. There's also something else that happens when you accept apologies without change. You begin teaching them that words are enough. You begin lowering the standard for what growth looks like. And over time, you may find yourself accepting less, hoping that eventually the behavior will match the promises. But love should not rely on potential. It should rely on evidence. You deserve someone who doesn't just apologize for hurting you, but actively works to avoid hurting you. Again, someone who understands that saying sorry is only the first step, not the entire journey. Someone who recognizes that rebuilding trust requires more than intention. It requires consistent effort. Because anyone can say the right words when they fear losing you, but not everyone is willing to do the difficult work that follows. Not everyone is willing to face their patterns, challenge their fears, and grow beyond their comfort zone. And that's the difference between temporary returns and lasting change. One sounds good in the moment. The other feels steady over time. So when they come back with apologies, listen carefully. Let their words be heard, but let their actions be your guide. Because when someone has truly changed, you won't just hear it, you'll experience it. And when the behavior doesn't change, neither will the outcome. You deserve more than apologies that repeat. You deserve change that lasts. Sometimes the most confusing thing isn't that the player you performed. It's that they came back, but nothing truly felt closer. They return, they reconnect, they re-enter your life, yet there's still a distance you can't quite explain. You're talking again, you're spending time again, but emotionally, something still feels out of reach. And that's when you realize that physical presence doesn't always mean emotional availability. When an avoidant comes back, but keeps you at a distance, the relationship often begins to feel like you're standing at the door of something meaningful, but never being fully invited inside. They're there, but not completely. They care, but not openly. They engage, but only to a certain point. And every time things begin to deepen, there's an invisible wall that rises again. At first, it can be subtle. They might avoid discussing the future. They might hesitate when conversations become more meaningful. They might keep things light, playful, and surface level. And while that may feel comfortable for a while, over time, you begin to notice what's missing. You notice the lack of emotional depth. You notice the absence of reassurance. You notice that even though they're back, you're still unsure where you truly stand, and uncertainty creates distance. Even when someone is physically present, you might start questioning small things. Why did they talk about long-term plans? Why do they seem uncomfortable when you express deeper feelings? Why does it feel like they're holding a part of themselves back? These questions don't come from insecurity. They come from sensing inconsistency between presence and connection. Avoidants often return because they miss the comfort, the familiarity, the safety of someone who understands them. But emotional closeness requires more than familiarity. It requires openness, vulnerability, and intentional effort. And if those elements are still missing, then the return back ohms more about maintaining access than building intimacy. This is where many people get stuck. They think, at least they came back. They focus on the fact that they're trying, that they're present again, that they didn't fully walk away. But partial presence can sometimes be more confusing than absence, because absence gives clarity. Distance without explanation creates doubt. You begin to adjust your expectations again. You tell yourself to be patient. You tell yourself not to push too hard. You start accepting less emotional closeness just to keep the connection alive. And slowly, without realizing it, you find yourself shrinking your needs again. But love shouldn't require you to reduce your emotional expectations. It shouldn't require you to settle for surface-level connection when your heart is asking for something deeper. When someone truly wants to build something meaningful, they don't keep you at a distance. They move closer, gradually, but intentionally. Real growth looks like someone letting you into their thoughts, their fears, their intentions. It looks like someone being willing to discuss where things are going. It looks like someone offering reassurance without being asked. It looks like emotional availability, not just physical presence, because emotional distance doesn't always look like silence. Sometimes it looks like conversations that never go deeper. Sometimes it looks like affection without clarity. Sometimes it looks like connection that feels incomplete. And over time, that incomplete connection can leave you feeling lonely, even while being with them. You may begin to feel like you are the only one trying to deepen the bond. You may start wondering if you're asking for too much, when in reality, you're only asking for consistency and openness. The truth is, when someone returns but keeps you at a distance, they're showing you that 3 are still protecting themselves more than they're investing in the relationship. And while it's natural for someone to take time to open up, there should still be movement. There should still be progress. There should still be a sense that things are growing, not just repeating. You deserve a love that moves toward you, not one that keeps you standing in uncertainty. You deserve someone who doesn't just come back, but comes back with the intention to build something deeper than before. Because returning is only meaningful when it leads to growth. And when someone keeps you at a distance, after coming back, it often means the same emotional walls are still standing. And if those walls never come down, you'll find yourself in the same place again, close enough to hope, but never close enough to feel secure. You deserve more than partial closeness. You deserve someone who not only returns but truly lets you in. Accountability is one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity, and without it, real change cannot happen. When someone returns but still refuses to take responsibility for their past behavior, it's often a sign that the same patterns are waiting beneath the surface. Because growth begins when someone stops blaming circumstances, stops blaming timing, and stops shifting responsibility, and instead looks inward. Avoidants who haven't truly grown often come back with explanations rather than accountability. They might say they were overwhelmed. They might say they were confused. They might say they needed space to figure things out. And while those reasons may sound reasonable, there's a subtle difference between explaining behavior and owning it. Explaining can sometimes become a way to justify what happened, while accountability acknowledges the impact, regardless of the reason. When someone takes true accountability, they don't just talk about what they felt. They acknowledge how their actions affected you. They don't minimize your experience. They don't brush past the hurt. They recognize that their distance, inconsistency, or withdrawal created pain, and they accept that responsibility without defensiveness. But when accountability is missing, something else happens. Conversations about the past become uncomfortable. When you bring up how you felt, they may become dismissive or defensive. They might say you're overthinking. They might suggest that things weren't as serious as you experienced them, or they might avoid the conversation altogether, hoping time alone will erase what happened. And over time, this creates emotional imbalance. You're left carrying the weight of the past, while they move forward as if nothing significant occurred. You may begin to question your own feelings, wondering if you're asking for too much, when in reality, you're simply asking for acknowledgement. Accountability is important because it builds trust. When someone takes responsibility, it shows they understand their patterns. It shows they're aware of how their actions affect others. And most importantly, it shows they're willing to grow beyond those patterns. Without that awareness, change becomes unlikely because you cannot fix what you refuse to recognize. Avoidants who lack accountability often repeat the same cycle because they don't see themselves as part of the problem. If everything is blamed on stress, timing, or circumstances, then nothing needs to change internally. And when nothing changes internally, the outcome eventually stays the same. You may notice that when conflicts arise again, they respond in familiar ways. They withdraw instead of communicating. They become distant instead of addressing the issue. They create space instead of working through discomfort. And suddenly you realize you're reliving the bad. Same emotional journey. True accountability also comes with humility. It comes with someone being willing to say, I handled that poorly, or I hurt you, and I understand why. These moments may seem small, but they carry deep meaning. They show emotional awareness. They show care. They show that someone values the relationship enough to reflect on their actions. Without accountability, the relationship often feels fragile. You may feel hesitant to express concerns because you anticipate defensiveness. You may feel like you're the only one trying to improve things. And gradually, you may start suppressing your feelings just to avoid conflict. But love should never require silence. It should create space for honesty, reflection, and growth. When someone truly wants to build something meaningful, they don't avoid responsibility. They embrace it, even when it's uncomfortable. They understand that accountability isn't about blame. It's about understanding, learning, and doing better. It's about showing through actions that they're not just returning, but evolving. Because when someone takes accountability, you feel it. You feel the sincerity. You feel the effort. You feel the intention to create something healthier than before. But when accountability is missing, the return often becomes temporary. It becomes another chapter in the same story, where hope rises and slowly fades again. And over time, that cycle becomes emotionally exhausting. You deserve someone who doesn't just come back, but comes back with awareness. Someone who understands their role in what happened and is willing to grow beyond it. Someone who doesn't shift responsibility, but accepts it with maturity and intention. Because accountability isn't just about the past. It's about building a future that doesn't repeat it. Your emotions often recognize the truth long before your mind is ready to accept it. You may try to convince yourself that things are different this time, that they've changed, that the return means something deeper. But beneath the surface, there's a feeling you can ignore, a quiet uneasiness, a sense that you're still waiting for something to go wrong. And when you feel more anxiety than peace, it's often a sign that the foundation hasn't truly changed. When someone comes back into your life, you naturally want to feel safe again. You want to relax into the connection, to trust that this time will be stable. But if you find yourself constantly overthinking, analyzing their tone, or wondering where you stand, it becomes emotionally exhausting. You begin to read into small things, how long they take to respond, whether their energy feels different, whether they seem distant for no clear reason. And slowly, your mind becomes busy trying to predict their behavior. This kind of anxiety doesn't appear without reason. It often develops from past experiences within the same relationship. When someone has been inconsistent before, your heart remembers, even if you want to move forward. A part of you stays cautious. You may tell yourself to relax, but you still feel guarded. You may try to trust again, but you still notice every shift. Over time, this emotional tension begins to shape your behavior. You might hesitate before expressing your needs because you're afraid of pushing them away. You might avoid difficult conversations because you don't want them to create distance. Again, you might even lower your expectations just to keep the connection stable, and without realizing it, you begin adjusting yourself to maintain something that should naturally feel secure. But love should not feel like you're constantly managing the relationship alone. It should not feel like you're walking carefully to avoid triggering distance. Real connection brings a sense of calm, not confusion. It allows you to be yourself without fear of losing someone for simply expressing how you feel. When someone truly returns with growth, you age in to notice a shift in your emotions. You feel more relaxed. You feel less worried about sudden distance. You feel confident in their presence rather than uncertain about their intentions. It doesn't mean everything becomes perfect, but there is a sense of stability that gradually replaces anxiety. Peace in a relationship doesn't mean there are no challenges. It means you trust that challenges will be handled with care. It means you believe that even during difficult moments, the connection will remain steady. And that kind of peace comes from consistency, honesty, and emotional availability. If those elements are missing, anxiety often takes their place. You may find yourself replaying conversations in your mind, wondering if you said too much or too little. You may question whether they are truly invested or just temporarily present. You may constantly look for reassurance, not because you're insecure, but because the connection doesn't feel stable enough to stand on its own. And this is where you have to listen to your emotions without judgment. Anxiety is not always a sign that something is wrong with you. Sometimes it's a signal that something feels uncertain in the relationship. It's your heart trying to protect you from repeating the same experience. You deserve a love that brings clarity, not confusion. You deserve someone whose presence calms your thoughts rather than intensifies them. You deserve a connection where you don't have to constantly question whether they'll stay or pull away. Because when someone is truly ready, their actions create reassurance naturally. You don't have to chase it. You don't have to overthink it. You don't have to fight for it. It simply grows from consistent behavior and emotional reliability. When you feel more peace than anxiety, you know something is different. You feel grounded instead of uncertain. You feel secure instead of guarded. And that's the kind of love that supports you rather than drains you. If anxiety remains stronger than peace, it may be a sign that the return hasn't changed the foundation.